I wanted to challenge myself with a fine woodworking project, and I thought, well, what better way to do that than with solid wood furniture? So I designed a little end table in Fusion, printed off some plans, and got to creating. I picked out some rough sawn walnut and started processing it. First thing I do is cut it to rough length, all the boards. This makes it easier to run through the planer. Makes things a little bit more manageable. Then I had 4 boards milled, front and back, even thickness, labeled to keep things organized. 2 more boards here, more labeling, and the last boards, at least right now, going through. And before I knew it, I had all my pieces cut and milled. Okay, I lied. The boards aren't fully milled, just the faces are. And I don't have a jointer, but I do have a table saw in this jig. Using these micro jig clamps and a dovetail slot in that sheet of plywood, I can secure the board down and run it along the fence to get a nice clean cut. And then I can flip the piece over and run it along my regular table saw fence and get 2 parallel edges nice and clean. And then I just rinsed and repeated for the rest of the boards, and before I knew it, I had the top ready to glue up. On my Christmas wish list this year are some actual parallel clamps, but in the meantime I'm stuck with these pipe clamps, and they work pretty well. So I spread glue using my finger and a little roller and get things sandwiched, and then just crank down those clamps and wait. Oh, I added that caul on top to keep things flat. Anyway, back to more milling, same process as before to clean up the rest of the boards. And now I'm face gluing 2 boards together because I only had 4/4 stock and I wanted the legs to be about 1.5 inches. So more glue and a bunch of clamps, and then it's a waiting game again. And while that was drying, I could move on to cutting all of the stretcher pieces. I'm calling them stretcher pieces, that makes sense to me. Anyway, there are 2 long ones on top, 2 short ones on top, and 2 short ones on the bottom. That was probably confusing, but just hang with me here, you'll see it shortly. And then before I knew it, I had the 2 long top, 2 short top, and 2 short bottom. The next day I could start pulling clamps off. That top piece is looking good. And then moving on to the legs. Yes, that board will be legs in the near future. And then I thought long and hard about the best way to join all this together, and I decided on tried and true dowels. Mostly just because I don't have a domino or any other fancy piece of equipment. So I made my own doweling jig using some scrap maple and plywood and these brass or bronze, I can't remember the metal, but they're bushings that are 3/8 inch ID, so they guide the drill bit. And here I am drilling those holes. And this is actually kind of a scary thing that happened here. The piece catches, and you'll see there that my hand kind of wraps around the bit. Oh yeah. I looked down, had all my fingers, and things felt fine. So I proceeded, but I should not do that in the future. Anyway, I'm clamping in the brass bushings, and I'm securing this piece to the other piece, the fence, and letting that dry. Then I could cut the top down closer to its final length to make it a little easier to work with, and squaring up both ends. And then using my off-cut scraps intelligently, I can get the most bang for my buck, so I'm gluing 2 boards together that are different thicknesses that I'll clean up later. Then I ran the top through the planer to get it down to its final thickness, which was just over an inch. Then using my quote-unquote jointer, I trimmed up the edge of the leg piece and cut 4 legs here. Actually, this piece only got me 3. No, wait, it got 4. I'm crazy. Anyway, they were a little over 1.5 inches. And then because I had free clamps again, I glued up the bottom panel using those pipe clamps. I need some parallel clamps. And then I sent all the leg pieces through the planer, got them down to just under 1.5 inches in one direction, and then I rotated the legs 90 degrees, sent them through again, and this made sure that I had an even square. And this worked pretty well, actually. And then I took those over to the table saw and trimmed the edges, or at least one edge flush, before I set up a stop block on my sled, and then trimmed all 4 to their final length. And finally, here, this is the moment we've all been waiting for, to see what this thing is actually going to look like. Oh, that's nice. Okay, back to work. So I pulled this piece out of the clamps, free up my workbench there for some sanding. Oh, everyone's favorite activity here. Try not to bore you, but I think I used 120 grit on all of the pieces. And then some of my legs had some wormholes and knot holes in them that I filled with black CA glue and accelerator. I've done this before and it actually works pretty well. You just take a sharp chisel, clean up the surface, finish it off with some sandpaper, and it's good as new, really. This is what it looks like on the legs. And after sanding the stretchers, those are now done too. Well, after I cut them to length, of course, which I did on the sled there with a stop block. And now the leg assemblies were almost complete. There's just one operation left, and that is to put a taper on the bottom. So I marked that out on the inside and set up this jig. Hey, that's the jointing jig from before. Yes, it also doubles as a tapering jig. So I set up some stop blocks there to make the cut repeatable, slide in the next one, clamp it down, and run it through. And before I knew it, I had all 4 tapers done, and then a little bit of sanding to clean up the saw marks. And at this point, I couldn't procrastinate the joinery any longer, so I tested out my jig here on some pine, and it worked pretty well. Back to the end table, I wanted those stretchers to be inset 1/8 of an inch from the legs to give it a nicer profile and to make it look a little bit more elevated. So I cut this shim that is 1/8 of an inch that I can take in and out and sandwich on the piece when I want to offset it slightly. That'll make more sense later. But I clamped on my jig after marking the lines and started drilling. This was stressful. Moment of truth, I put some dowels in and see how it works, and it's a nice fit. Oh yeah. Then with that confidence boost, I moved on to the other side of the joint, marked, clamped, drilled, and tested. I dry fit this thing 1,000,000 times, just as I went. And here you can see that 1/8 of an inch reveal. That worked out well. With the tops of both sides done, I moved on to the bottom piece, assembled that the same way, and before I knew it, I had 2 leg assemblies complete. At least the sides. I still had to join those together, and I will be using, you guessed it, dowels. So I repeated the same process, and yeah, that is nice. The next day, I cut the bottom shelf to length and width, and then I marked where I wanted to put a dado in the bottom stretchers, cut that using the table saw, dry assembled everything for, again, the 1,000,000th time just to make sure it would work, and it looks like it will. Then I cut some bracket blocks that I'll use to secure the top. This will make more sense later on, before coming over here and routing a chamfer on the underside of the top. And in 2 passes I had this, and I thought it looked pretty good. Then I took everything outside and water popped it. This raises the grain, and after doing a final light hand sand, you get a super duper smooth finish. At least that's the theory. It works. If you remember all the boards I started with at the beginning, this is all that's left. I think that's an efficient use of material. I don't know. Anyway, it was now time to do the final glue up. In getting glue on the dowels and the faces, I assembled everything, and since I'd already put this thing together 1,000,000 times before in a dry state, it was actually not very stressful. And before I knew it, I had 2 pairs of legs done. Then I applied my brand on the underside of the top. A little bit of sanding to clean things up, and here's how it looks. A couple hours later, I pulled those legs out of the clamps. There are 2 clamps, that's plural. And then I rinsed and repeated with the rest of the glue up for those long stretchers and the bottom shelf. And again, this was not too stressful because I had already put this together a lot. Little painting shot of the glue drying, and after a couple hours I pulled off those clamps and started attaching those brackets that I talked about earlier. They're just little blocks with the hole drilled in them, and then a countersink on the other side for the screw heads. Then the next day I could attach that top, and using a spacer block I got that centered, at least the best that I could. Clamped it in place, and using a drill bit I transferred the whole locations, man, plurals, tough today. Anyway, I drilled those holes and screwed on the top. Then I couldn't resist doing a strength test by sitting on it. And here's where the whole thing falls apart. No, not really. It was pretty solid. And finally, on to finish. For the top, I'm going to be using Rubio Monocoat in pure satin, mostly just because I had a little bit left and I wanted to go ahead and use it up. You mix it together and then buff it on with a non-scratching Scotch-Brite before wiping it off completely. And then for everything else, I'll use Osmo Poly X oil. It is also a hard wax oil that you buff on and then wipe off. And midway through, I noticed a glue stain that I had missed earlier, so I sanded that off, applied more finish, and it was good as new. That's one of the nice things about these hard wax oils. They're super easy to maintain and repair. So finally, after 2 coats of Osmo, here it is in all of its glory. I'm super happy with how this turned out. It was a lot of work. I think I counted something like 30 hours into this piece. But I learned a lot, and it was a ton of fun. So thanks for watching.